The icy October breeze whipped across the platform of Union Station. In Chicago, as Pedro, 21, an engineering student with weary eyes, awaited the train to Philadelphia. The sharp whistle cut through the air, and the locomotive emerged like a steel monster, expelling steam. Suddenly, the vision. Not a dream, but a vivid, cold reality. The train, in a dark tunnel, folding like crumpled paper, its carriages twisted violently against the damp walls. Screams, echoes of metal, and silence. A chilling premonition pierced Pedro to his soul. That train was a tomb. Pedro staggered backward, his breath caught in his throat. The smell of diesel and hot metal from the station, once routine, now felt funereal. His eyes scanned the train before him, each window a portal to the tragedy he had just witnessed in his mind. His heart pounded uncontrollably in his chest. It was too real to be a hallucination, too vivid to be a daydream. He felt cold sweat trickle down his spine, contrasting with the sharp morning air. The chilling air seemed to carry the weight of a dark secret, and the platform's atmosphere, once vibrant with travel anticipation, now radiated a palpable tension. He tried to put a hand on Pedro's shoulder, but he dodged him. The crumpled carriages, the people very few survivors. The expression in Pedro's eyes was one of pure terror, not tiredness or joking. She hesitated. The cold wind on the platform whipped her hair, and she felt a shiver. "Pedro, I know you're nervous, but..." Panic began to consume him, a wave of despair that threatened to drown him. He grabbed Sarah's arm, his fingers tightening with involuntary force. The fabric of her coat felt rough under his trembling fingers. "You have to believe me." The smell of fresh coffee from a nearby snack bar seemed absurdly mundane given the catastrophe Pedro believed was imminent. The muffled sound of passengers' conversations and the metallic grind of the train's wheels on the tracks seemed distorted, almost unreal, amidst Pedro's escalating panic, and pointed to the dark tunnel in the distance, through which the train would pass. The odor of dampness and wet earth coming from the tunnel's mouth seemed to intensify the sense of danger. "I saw the train crashing in there." "Pedro, are you just going to stand there?" Passengers began to gather at the carriage doors, most smiling with relief at finally starting their journey. The hustle and bustle of voices, the grinding of the train's wheels against the tracks, the occasional whistle, everything seemed to intensify, like a soundtrack to his own nightmare. He looked around, seeking support in unfamiliar faces, but found only curious glances, some irritated, others disdainful. No one took him seriously. To them, he was just a disturbed young man. The air in the station, once merely cold, now seemed to carry an extra weight, almost oppressive. The vibration of the train on the platform floor reached his feet, a premonition of what was to come. The voice of his college friend, Sarah, 20, an aspiring journalist with insatiable curiosity and fiery red hair, roused him. "Pedro, you need to calm down. It's just a train. We've been through this hundreds of times." He pointed to the passengers, who were already starting to board. The metal of the train's wheels, a few meters from him, seemed to pulse with the energy of death. Such a vivid, real premonition could not be ignored. He had to do something, anything, to prevent the inevitable. But how to convince someone of something so unbelievable? Despair deepened, and with each passing second, time seemed to run out. He could feel the cold embrace of fate approaching. The distant sound of a siren seemed like an omen, a warning only he could decipher. She was walking towards him, pulling a small rolling suitcase. Beside her, Mark, 22, an athletic medical student with an easy smile and an anatomy book in hand, waved. "The train is going to derail. In the tunnel. It's going to be horrible." His lips were dry, and he felt his throat scratch with each word spoken. Both were eager for the Thanksgiving holiday with their families. The sweet scent of Sarah's shampoo and the subtle smell of Mark's disinfectant brought a hint of normalcy to a moment Pedro felt was anything but normal. "We can't go on that train," Pedro stammered, his voice choked. His eyes were fixed on the approaching train, its carriages seemingly emptying of passengers in his inner vision. A wave of alternating hot and cold washed over his body, and his hands clenched into fists. Sarah frowned. "What are you saying? It's our train." I had a vision," Pedro continued, his voice gaining urgency. Mark chuckled, a nervous laugh. "Vision? Pedro, you've been studying too much. Maybe it's pre-holiday stress." "It's not stress, I saw it." Sarah looked at him, the smile on her lips slowly fading. "Nervous? I'm trying to save our lives." He let go of her arm, frustrated. A warning sound echoed through the station, announcing imminent boarding. Mark sighed, shaking his head. "Not this train," Pedro shouted, his voice almost lost in the station's noise. The smell of smoke and diesel fuel, once just a background presence, now seemed to invade his lungs, suffocating him. The attendant's voice echoed through the platform. "Last call for the train to Philadelphia." Hastily, the last passengers climbed the steps, their suitcases dragging on the floor, creating a rough sound on the concrete. She extended her hand to him, but Pedro remained motionless, his body tense, every muscle alert. He turned to them, his eyes watery. "Please, don't go. Please." A single tear streamed down his cheek, mixing with the cold sweat. The chilling breath of the station enveloped him, and he felt a tingling sensation in his fingertips. Sarah and Mark, still hesitant, watched Pedro, who seemed to have entered a trance. The smell of metal and burning brakes intensified, almost nauseating. He turned his back on the train that represented death, and began to run in the opposite direction, out of the station. He ran without looking back, the vision of the derailing train etched in his mind, propelling every step. The cold air hit his face, but sweat was still streaming down his forehead, hot and sticky. Fear was a constant companion, and with each step, he felt he was tricking death, at least for now. The cold wind whipped his face, but the need to escape was stronger than the discomfort. The sound of the train's whistle diminished as he moved away, replaced by the city's hum. However, the buzzing in his ears persisted, a constant reminder of the premonition. He allowed himself a single glance back at the dark mouth of the tunnel where the train disappeared. A shiver ran down his spine. He had escaped by a thread. The relief, however, was ephemeral, mixed with an oppressive sense of uncertainty. What did fate have in store for him now? The gray Chicago sky hung over him, mirroring the emptiness he felt inside. His ears buzzed with the train's noise, which was slowly beginning to move, a giant of iron awakening, its wheels grinding on the tracks with a low moan. His eyes were fixed on the tunnel, as if the horror scene he had foreseen was unfolding right there before his eyes. The cold wind on the platform seemed to whisper warnings in his ears. She tried to follow him for a moment, but the space between them widened rapidly. "Pedro, come on! The train's leaving," Sarah called, her voice filled with concern. "I can't," he mumbled, his voice almost inaudible. "I can't get on that train." "It's a trap." Mark rolled his eyes, frustrated. "Pedro, stop it. It's not funny. We're missing the train because of some nonsense." He was already heading for the carriage door, resignation clear on his face. The sound of his hurried footsteps echoed on the platform. "It's not nonsense," Pedro shouted, desperation making his voice hoarse. "It's death. I saw it." He tried to pull Sarah away, but she resisted, torn between Mark's logic and her friend's evident anguish. The doors began to close with a noisy, mechanical hiss, like a monster breathing. Pedro's heart raced, and a wave of adrenaline coursed through his body. He couldn't convince them. Fate, or something like it, seemed to be playing with him. He had two options: board what he saw as his end or walk away, even if it meant leaving his friends. The biting cold of the morning transformed into a deep shiver that ran through him from head to toe. The smell of metal and grease from the train, intensified as the doors hissed shut. The train's whistle blew once more, a final warning. The air on the platform, already cold, seemed to become even denser, almost palpable, as if time itself was bending under the pressure of his decision. With a cry of anguish that no one seemed to hear, Pedro made his choice. "Pedro, where are you going?" Sarah shouted, her voice lost in the increasing noise of the train. He didn't answer. He just kept running, pushing through the crowd of passengers hurrying to their own destinations, bumping into people, uttering mechanical apologies he barely heard. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get away from that train, that platform, that station. Pedro kept running until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. He stopped in a dark, damp alley, leaning his hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. The smell of garbage and dampness filled the air, a stark contrast to the industrial scent of the station. The intense cold of October in Chicago penetrated his thin clothes, but sweat was still running down his body, a remnant of the terror that had propelled him. His eyes, restless, watched the dancing shadows, each silhouette a potential threat. The wind howled softly between the buildings, creating an almost mournful sound. He took out his cell phone, his hands trembling, and called his parents. His mother's voice sounded worried. The tone of her voice was a balm, but guilt gnawed at him. "Pedro? Where are you? Shouldn't you be on the train?" "No, Mom, I missed the train," he lied, his voice still hoarse, scratching his throat. Telling the truth, the premonition, would be useless. They would think he was crazy. "I had to sort out some last-minute things. I'm heading home." There was a heavy silence on the other end. "But what about your friends? Sarah and Mark?" Pedro's heart tightened. They went. "I told them not to go, but they didn't listen." The weight of guilt hit him hard, like a punch to the gut. He had abandoned them. But what else could he have done? Force people to believe something that defied logic? He tasted the bitter taste of helplessness in his mouth. "Well, at least you're safe, my son." "Come home soon," his mother said, relief palpable in her voice. Her relief was a burden to him, knowing what had happened. Pedro ended the call and leaned against the cold, dirty alley wall. Fear still dominated him, but now it was mixed with a strange sense of desolation. He was alone. No one would believe him. He had avoided death, but at what cost? The smell of asphalt from the streets mixed with his own scent of sweat and panic. He began to walk aimlessly through Chicago's bustling streets, his eyes attentive to every corner, every sound. Cars passed noisily, horns blared, and the city's hum seemed a distant echo. The sky was gray and heavy, promising another cold, sunless afternoon. He felt an uncomfortable hunger in his stomach, but the idea of food was repulsive. Every incipient snowflake that touched his cold face seemed a reminder of life's fragility. He arrived at his apartment, a small studio in a busy neighborhood. The building was old, with the characteristic smell of mold and dust, but it was his refuge. He opened the door, threw his backpack on the floor, and collapsed onto the couch. The silence of the apartment was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall, which seemed to count the seconds of his own survival. He turned on the television, seeking some kind of distraction, some normality. The image on the news hit him like lightning. Terrible accident with the Union Pacific train. The report showed aerial images of the scene. Dark smoke rose from a tunnel, and the reporter's grave expression announced the tragedy. Pedro didn't need to hear the details, the numbers of dead and injured. He had already seen everything in his premonition. His stomach churned, and he felt a lump in his throat. Tears welled up in his eyes, hot and bitter. He had saved himself. Yes, but his friends. Sarah and Mark. The sight of them, excited for the trip, was now haunted by the image of the dark tunnel and the twisted carriages. Guilt, once a whisper, was now a deafening scream. He had tried to warn them, but it wasn't enough. He had escaped death's embrace, but the price was the pain of knowing what had happened. The relief of being alive was overshadowed by the crushing shadow of loss. He felt like a survivor in a cemetery, a ghost in a world of mourning, the weight of survival crushing him. Time seemed to have stopped. Pedro watched the news, stunned, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. The reporter spoke about the extent of the tragedy, the ongoing investigation, the rescue efforts. A cry of pain escaped Pedro's throat, a hoarse, tearing sound. The tears that had welled up before now streamed freely down his face, mixed with cold sweat. He felt empty, consumed by guilt and helplessness. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed, that, somehow, he was responsible. He had escaped, but why him? Why not them? The cold air outside was a shock to his tear-swollen face. The streets of Chicago, once just a blur in his desperate run, now seemed threatening. Every passing car, the sound of tires on the asphalt, every person who looked at him was a reminder of his fragility. The sound of the wind howling between the buildings seemed like a distant lament, a lament for those who were gone. The Premonition had saved him, but not without a terrible cost. The post office district was a few blocks away, in a more industrial area of the city, with its old warehouses and dark brick walls. But a dark thought insinuated itself into his mind. Would it be possible to cheat fate twice? The sense of relief he had felt at being alive after the train accident had dissipated, replaced by a disturbing feeling that death was still lurking, just waiting for the right moment to claim him. The biting cold of the night seemed to penetrate his clothes and reach his soul. The smell of grease and pollution hung in the air, mixed with the damp scent of autumn. The brick buildings, once just part of the urban landscape, now seemed enormous and oppressive, as if watching him, their dark windows like empty eyes. The relief of being alive was overshadowed by the crushing shadow of loss. He felt like a survivor in a cemetery, a ghost in a world of mourning, the weight of survival crushing him. But the feeling of being watched, of being in danger, did not leave him. The streets seemed deserted, and the sunlight was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, a beautiful, but melancholic twilight. The cold increased and he hunched his shoulders, feeling a shiver that didn't come just from the temperature. The train trap had been avoided, but fate, he realized, was persistent, and it seemed to have other plans for him. The echo of his own footsteps on the asphalt seemed to follow him, a constant reminder of his solitude and vulnerability. The salt of the tears stung his swollen eyes. He needed something to pull him out of that state of stupor. A simple idea popped into his mind. He needed to pick up a package at the post office. It was an excuse, a momentary escape from the suffocating reality. The silence in the apartment was suffocating, and any movement felt like a release. The images on the screen were terrifying. The dark tunnel, the smoking metallic debris, the emergency teams working amid smoke and desolation. The smell of reheated pizza, which he had left on the table, mingled with the odor of anguish, a bittersweet scent of life and death. He curled up on the sofa, hugging his knees, seeking some comfort that didn't exist. The cold of the apartment seemed to seep into his bones, reflecting the ice in his soul. Every detail, every word, was a punch to Pedro's gut. He had seen it. He had felt the terror of that moment. The phantom smell of smoke and twisted metal seemed to permeate the air of his living room. A photo of Sarah and Mark, smiling and embracing, appeared on the screen, part of the passenger list. The reporter confirmed both their deaths. The clock on the wall, which before had merely ticked, now seemed to hammer in his ears, each second a reminder of the time that had run out for his friends. Hours passed and the news continued to update the tragedy. The pain in Pedro's chest was excruciating. Hunger and thirst, previously ignored, began to gnaw at his stomach. He got up, staggering, and grabbed his keys. He decided to walk, to try and clear his head. As he walked, the premonition of the tunnel returned to his mind, He had escaped. He had cheated death. He quickened his pace, an urgent need to reach his destination and return to the safety of his apartment. Pedro finally spotted the post office building, a square, dark brick structure, illuminated by a few fluorescent lamps that cast a cold, pale light. He quickened his pace, feeling an irrational urgency to get in and out as quickly as possible. The smell of paper and old glue, common in postal offices, mingled with a faint odor of dampness, typical of old buildings. The silence inside the building was almost oppressive, broken only by the hum of computers. Upon entering, the air was stuffy and dry. Few people were waiting for service, and the sound of stamps and the faint hum of computers were the only noises in the environment. The train disaster, the deaths of Sarah and Mark, seemed like a distant nightmare, although the pain in his chest was still real. He looked outside at the city lights that passed quickly, forming a luminous trail. The noise increased, and the bus began to shake violently. Pedro clutched the seat, his heart pounding like a frantic drum. The streetlights became a blur. It was a truck, an out-of-control truck coming towards him, its lights blinding in the darkness like the eyes of a monster. The sound of other vehicles' horns, the screams of some passengers, everything mixed into a deafening chaos, a symphony of terror. Street lighting was scarce, and the shadows lengthened and danced with the night breeze, looking like distorted, menacing shapes. Not the whistle of a train, but a different sound. A loud, shrill scraping sound of metal, which seemed to tear the air. The bus floor began to vibrate violently. Darkness swallowed the bus, and the lights became distorted, confused streaks. The metal twisting, the glass shattering with a sound like 1,000 knives. An inaudible scream escaped his throat, swallowed by the noise. The darkness of the tunnel became complete, and he realized with chilling dread that death, which he had tried so hard to cheat, had finally found him. The cold of death enveloped him, and the world faded to black. The smell of smoke and something burning invaded his nostrils, suffocating him. The sound of the approaching truck was deafening, a bestial roar, and Pedro felt the impact before he even saw it. The bus was thrown sideways, a toy in the hands of an invisible and relentless force. He felt himself being thrown forward, backward, sideways, like a rag doll, his body hitting the seat. He looked at the bus's internal rearview mirror, at the driver, who had an expression of pure panic in his eyes, wide and fixed on what was approaching. The distant sound of sirens broke the night silence, and Pedro felt a shiver run down his spine. Every sound, every shadow, seemed to amplify his anxiety. He felt like a target, invisible but constantly watched. He picked up his package, a small parcel that barely fit in his hands, and hurried out. The smell of wet asphalt from the intensifying mist hung in the air. The wait seemed endless. Pedro looked around, restless, a feeling that something was about to happen gnawing at him from the inside. He had escaped the train. But now what? Had fate, in some way, reset its pointers? The night's cold seemed to penetrate his skin, making him shiver. Night had already fallen, and the temperature had dropped even further. A thin mist began to rise from the ground, enveloping the streetlights in diffuse halos, creating a ghostly atmosphere. He decided he wouldn't walk back. A bus stop was just a few blocks away, at the end of the street. When he reached the bus stop, a small, rusty metal shelter, there was only an elderly lady and a young man with headphones. Finally, the bus lights appeared at the end of the street, cutting through the mist. A momentary relief washed over him. The bus stopped with a hiss of brakes, and Pedro got on, relieved to be inside, away from the cold and the shadows. The bus was almost empty, with only a few scattered passengers. The smell of old upholstery and disinfectant mingled in the air, a familiar and comforting aroma in its simplicity, a false sense of security. He sat in one of the window seats, watching the receding street. The bus began to move, and Pedro relaxed a little, feeling the gentle swaying of the vehicle. He was almost home, almost safe. It was then that he heard it. A sound. The smell of burning rubber invaded the environment, stinging his nostrils. The tunnel. He was entering a tunnel. The same tunnel he had seen in his premonition, or a very similar one. The last thing Pedro felt was the impact. A crushing impact that consumed him. The scene was chaotic. The bus, now a twisted mass of metal and glass, was crushed against the tunnel wall. Its body crumpled like a discarded soda can. The truck, an out-of-control steel monster, lay overturned nearby, emitting smoke and oil, its engine still moaning in agony. The screams for help, the murmurs of pain, the calls of paramedics, all mixed into a cacophony of despair. And full of life was now part of that landscape of destruction, silent and still. There was no more pain, no more fear, no more guilt that haunted him. The train premonition, so vivid and terrifying, had materialized in a different, unexpected way. Other trains would pass, other buses would follow their routes, routines unaffected by individual tragedy. He saw death approaching, and for an instant, he thought he could escape. But fate, with its intricate web, allows no loopholes. Pedro's last boarding was not on a train, but on a bus in a tunnel that sealed his destiny. But for Pedro, the journey had ended. There was no escape from the end. He had diverted from one path, only to be led to another, equally relentless. The echo of the sounds bounced back and forth off the tunnel walls, amplifying the horror, creating a nightmarish atmosphere. And you, what would you do if you knew the day of your last boarding? News reports spoke of the truck that had lost its brakes, of the fatality that struck the bus deep inside the tunnel, with graphic details of the devastation. Pedro's name was mentioned among the fatalities, another number in the sad statistics, just a name on a growing list. No one, except perhaps his parents, ever knew of the premonition, of his desperate attempt to cheat fate. They would be left with the pain of loss and the mystery of his premonition. The temperature inside the tunnel was stifling, contrasting with the damp cold outside. Ambulances and police cars wailed frantically, their lights flashing in the tunnel's damp darkness, painting the walls with shades of blue and red, a macabre spectacle. The smell of fuel and burnt rubber hung in the air, dense and suffocating, irritating the nostrils of the rescuers. Rescue teams worked feverishly, their helmets and flashlights illuminating the tragic scene. He escaped a derailment only to be crushed. He avoided one tunnel, only to meet his end in another. Fate, or death, had not been cheated. It had simply reset its course with terrifying precision. Pedro was there, or what was left of him. His body, once so vibrant the media quickly covered the new disaster. His death was a silent echo of the first premonition, a cruel irony of the universe. Life went on, indifferent to his passing. The tunnel would be cleared, traffic restored. The premonition had been a gift, but also a curse. The shadow of the premonition extended beyond his death, leaving a silent question hanging in the air. If fate is inevitable, what's the point of trying to run?